What's up, y'all? I'm Zach,
I'm Lucas. I'm Chris.
and we did Kretschmar and Torres's Challenges, Achievements, and Uncertainties, the Philosophy of Sport. Next slide, please.
Challenges, achievements, and uncertainties. Philosophy is currently philosophy of sport is currently a subdiscipline of kinesiology, but there's many challenges of having philosophy be a part of kinesiology, as kinesiology is a natural science intensive field. Um, Roberta Park states that the problem is philosophy's emphasis on reason rather than cause, logical rather than experimental methods of uh, research. Although philosophy suggests that it might be the one subdiscipline that can best help diverse the field of kinesiology, there is a huge disconnect between uh, past kinesiologists, researchers, and their use and endorsement of philosophy in their research. Thus, there's a lack of philosophy being used in research in the field of kinesiology. Next slide, please.
Okay, so challenges faced by the philosophy of sport. Philosophy of sport has seen a lot of visibility and support since the early days, especially after the disciplinary movement. However, many different headwinds have hindered the movement of philosophy of sport. Some of the other disciplines have seen these challenges, but in the next couple slides, I'm going to be going over those that affected the philosophy of sport to a great degree. Next slide, please. Okay, so unfavorable trends in higher education. Kinesiology has been affected by larger trends in higher education overall. Over the past 50 years, major programs in humanities have declined in relative numbers. For example, 1% of the baccalaureate graduates majored in psych from 71 to 2018, and that dropped to 0.5%. On the other hand, health and health-related majors grew from 3% to 12% over that same time frame. So this trend showcased philosophy overall, including philosophy of sport, was on that short end of the trend. Next slide, please. Increased pressure on kinesiology curricula. Disciplinary courses in the 60s to the 80s showed an increase in pressure on the undergraduate major programs. Disciplinary faculty wanted more curricular space for their own courses, including prereqs such as biology or physiology. Whereas on the other hand, professional faculty resisted and said they couldn't give up any more curricular ground that could prepare the students for the marketplace. This led to sport philosophy being cut or not being seen as a necessity. Next slide, please. The disciplinary movement in kinesiology applied pressure on for more academic expertise. So overall, this affected all the subdisciplines in the natural sciences. However, this affected the academic expertise of humanities differently. So prior to the 20th century, faculty were educated under a generalist paradigm in graduate school, meaning that their education was focused around admin or health education. Some of these times, some of this would pertain to philosophy, but mostly not. These individuals could have taken one course in humanities and been considered qualified to teach principal courses in these principal courses. After the disciplinary specialization movement, generalists were not prepared to teach this new philosophy of sport literature, leading to the offerings of philosophy to be an elective in higher education. Next slide, please. Okay, resistance to the parent from the parent discipline. So prior to the 60s disciplinary movement, the philosophical work was primarily created in-house, leading to no foundation for collaboration with mainstream philosophy. So early disciplinary works by physical philosophers didn't receive much notice from the philosophic community. At the time, philosophy was seen as a staid or conservative discipline. This led to philosophy of sport being seen as not important or worth investigating. Next slide, please. Okay, so errors made by disciplinary sport philosophers. So those that worked in the early stages of the disciplinary movement took Franklin Henry's advice too close to heart, meaning that early disciplinary philosophers wanted to fully honor the distinction between philosophy and the broad scope. So they were trying too hard to think and write as, quote, real philosophers, and avoided applying topics such as education, health, and fitness. So Earl Ziegler was one of the senior members of this group, and was worried about this. So sport philosophers found themselves talking amongst themselves rather than other philosophers. Next slide, please.
Okay, so some of the hot topics since the formalization of philosophy of sport um, included the publication of Suit's book titled The Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia, which laid the groundwork for philosophy and sport by saying games are activities governed by rules that create unnecessary obstacles for achievement of the stated goals in the sport. Also, he stated that rules were accepted for the sake of activity. The next topic that they looked at was sport and beauty, or the connection between sport and beauty. So they looked at whether sports could be artistic and aesthetic within the realms of the sports, formal rules, and competition. And they also looked at whether some sports should be judged by its aesthetics. Another topic that they looked into was they had an increased interest in relationship between sport and moral values. So one thing they looked at was formalism, which was created by those who believe in following the formally established rules and winning by following those said rules. So, and then they also looked at the rival theory, which the rival theory focused on the role of ethos in the game, which is a set of unofficial implicit conventions which determine how the rules are applied to the game. People who believed in the rival theory are also known as conventionalists. A next big topic that they looked at was doping. They looked at whether they should keep sports fair and safe for users in society, and they also looked at whether they should just not restrict human freedom and allow players to partake in doping. Although over the years, it's heavily leaned towards keeping the game fair and keeping drugs out of the sports. The next big topic that they looked at was gender equity. So they looked at, whether it was creating more opportunities for women in sports, giving them equal opportunity. And they also looked at whether they should change the rules for women. And lastly, they looked at the inclusion of transgender athletes in sport. Next, they looked at sports and religion, but they looked at what the true sports fan is. So they dived into the deeper meaning of what it is to be a true sports fan. And they looked at how ethical and wider cultural values relate to the experience of the athletes and the sporting community. This is also looked at the good life, which focuses on the journey rather than the product of the end goal. And lastly, they looked at the theories within the sport, particularly how formalist and conventionalist interpreted the rules within sports. They also looked at how there might be principles embedded in the idea of sport as a practice, such as commitment to moral equality and athletic excellence. Next slide.
Philosophy of sport integration with other disciplines. When Brooks' volume was published 40 years ago, the philosophy of sport was not well integrated with other disciplines in kinesiology. The problem came from the philosophers' lack of connections made with social scientists, a lack of funding. Research was time consuming, and there's few incentives to conduct research. But after 4 decades, there's been a realization of interdependence and interpretation between philosophers of sport and social scientists, and there's become more prominent pathways between disciplines. Next slide, please. Ethics and performance enhancement. Ethics is a prime candidate for upfront collaboration and integration. The natural and social sciences are well equipped to analyze the what is or the how it works of performance enhancement, but their research tools were not suited for examining what should be. While natural scientists can study, for instance, the performance and health effects of different enhancement substances and techniques used by athletes to gain a competitive edge, they miss the arguments, our philosophers miss arguments related to fair play, analysis of how sporting traditions can be enhanced, harmed, and diminished, and principled discussions about how we can sensibly distinguish permissible from impermissible enhancements. Philosophers do not have lead collaborative efforts on such issues, but conversations must accumulate in more inclusive studies. Next slide, please. Meaning and motor control. Kinesiologists take subjective state emotions, feelings, recognitions, perceptions, and values seriously. This complicates analysis, however, of motor control grounded exclusively or primarily in physics, chemistry, biology, and physiology. However, these complications promise to produce a broader and more accurate understanding of human movements, as the effort to understand motor activity largely or solely in mechanistic terms wins the door for fruitful conversations between biomechanics, evolutionary biologists, and psychologists and philosophers, and opening the minds of these several research disciplines will benefit through the use of philosophy. This should benefit both those who focus on motor control as well as those who study the meaning and significance. Next slide, please. The good life, health, and longevity. This portion talked about axologists' research, which axology is the research of goodness or value. These philosophers looked at what it means to live a good life, as well as what are the requirements to classify someone as or something as a human being. Much of the research had ethical dilemmas as they looked at the sometimes negative effects of longevity in life if it affects quality of life. Incentives for collaboration and cooperation across disciplines are provided today now by granting an increased number of interdisciplinary journals, more democratic attitudes towards diverse research methodologies, and growing recognition of mutual dependency in kinesiology departments, and all to help shape and be shaped in part by contribution from such philosophic domains as ethics, philosophy of mind, and exology. Next slide, please.
Okay, so the current issues for philosophy and sport. So there's three main issues. The first issue is there's very few graduate programs in North America. There are very few colleges that actually offer like a degree within philosophy of sport. And then also there's a problem between the faculty in natural and social sciences versus the faculty in humanities. So the faculty in national social sciences are considered more viable because they are able to go out and compete for large grants, while the faculty in humanities have less opportunities to get external funding. This will then lead to inadequate programs because of the amount of money that they have. And also, the reason why the programs are inadequate is because they're taught by undertrained individuals because they have no training in the subject matter. And the next slide. Okay, so future directions for the philosophy of sport. So expanding and applying sport philosophy's body of knowledge. So they said that cultivators should converse with other professionals who are interested in physical education and extend their conversations beyond academic circles to sport governing bodies, governmental and community organizations, healthcare institutions, and media outlets. They also said that we should apply theory to societal challenges. So this includes like not only pressing issues in sport and kinesiology, but also larger societal issues related to health, well-being, and good living. They should also provide direction and leadership when it comes to these issues. And the last thing that they said was responding to the changing nature of global sport and physical activity. So they should consider and adapt to the changes and navigate all these challenges and opportunities offered by the present global society. And They should expand opportunities to underrepresented groups, so women and people of color. Doing this, branching out will enrich the philosophy of sport. And that is it for our presentation.